Over the years, Fugazi have achieved this almost mythic status, these paragons of punk ethic, that through Discord and their business practices took DIY independence to its absolute pinnacle. The band that was super serious straight edge vegans that didn't even use heating in winter.
Is it true that they don't use heat?
The band that never said yes. While their politics and ethics were super important, more than that, they were a band that changed things. Post-hardcore, as flimsy a signifier as it is, was the house Fugazi built. At the Drive-In, Refuse, Glassjaw, Biffy Clyro, and Deftones all took note from Fugazi's musical playbook. It is unwise to put bands on godlike pedestals, but in more simple terms than that, Fugazi rocked pretty hard. Many bands have done great things with less than great music. Fugazi did both, but through embellishment and oversimplification, they have become an idea more than a band. But let's focus on the band. Who were Fugazi? What made them different? And what makes them so much more than simply the band that wrote Waiting Room? Fugazi formed from members of various defunct Washington DC hardcore bands. Guitarist-vocalist Ian MacKaye had led the hugely influential Minor Threat, the band that spawned the straight edge movement. They imploded in late 1983, having released less than an hour of music. His next band, Embrace, formed in 1985 within the so-called Revolution Summer, a movement in DC hardcore where a handful of bands moved away from heavy, fast rules punk rock to something slower and more introspective. This new style was dubbed emotional hardcore, or emo, which originated with bands like Beefeater and Rites of Spring, the latter featuring future Fugazi members Guy Picciotto and drummer Brendan Canty. Both Embrace and Rites of Spring would be no more by the end of 1986 due to varying internal conflicts. MacKaye at this point understood the problem. At the end of that process, I realised that the mistake was that I thought I wanted to be in a band. What I should have been thinking about was wanting to play music. There's a distinction there. So I decided I wanted to play music and started looking for people to play music with, and we wouldn't be immediately focusing on being a band. Bassist Joe Lally was found roadieing with Beefeater. Him and MacKaye started playing together just to play. After a brief period with Dag Nasty drummer Colin Sears, in January 1987, Canty, now in Happy Go Licky with Picciotto, provisionally joined the still unnamed collective. They would rehearse together for another 6 months before the idea of playing a show was put forward. Their first live performance was on the 3rd of September 1987, and they had yet to add Picciotto to the lineup. Yet he still appears on the show's flyer as a waiter. By the second show, Picciotto was acting as hype man for Fugazi, as a kind of punk rock version of Public Enemy's Flavor Fave, his softer, more emotive croon bouncing off the more drill sergeant bellow of MacKaye. MacKaye stated in Our Band Could Be Your Life that initially he had wanted to start a band that was, like the Stooges, with reggae. His chunky low-end riffs inspired in part by Stooges' Ron Ashton. Lally's bassline were high-ended Joy Division-inspired things, with the occasional dub interlude. I broke the surface so I can breathe, I close my eyes so When Picciotto joined on guitar, he would play off MacKaye, him taking the scratchy, funk-inspired high ground, like a noise rock version of James Brown guitarist Jimmy Nolan. Bands like The Clash, Ruts, and even Queen have been connected to the sound Fugazi were trying to achieve. All in all, Fugazi were a huge evolutionary leap from early 80s hardcore, and from their first self-titled EP onwards, they had the punk scene's full attention. most immediately striking element of Waiting Room is the abrupt halt at the 22-second mark. In a lot of pop music, a lyric featuring the word stop will be followed by a slight pause or instrumental dropout.
You held my hand so tight as you stopped.
Sometimes I wish that I could stop you from talking when I
Stop. Hammer time.
Stop! But tell me, what happens when it stops? Hush, just stop.
It's a musical cliche, but it works because it shows a direct relationship between the lyric and the music. Fugazi even use it themselves on Epic Problem. Waiting Room's intro is that concept taken to the next level. And not just because the deafening silence is a whole 2 bars long. According to Fugazi historian Joe Gross, the lyric was supposedly written about Makai's growing impatience with being on the sidelines as DC Punk started another growth spurt. The pause is symbolic of his desire to start things, but having to stop. He has to remain a patient boy. Waiting Room was the first thing most people heard by Fugazi, not just because it was their nearest thing to a radio hit, but also because it's the first track on their first EP. The pause is empty, yet all too pregnant. But if you listen to the first demo version of the track, released to the public in 2014, you would hear it as a joke, a fuck up by the band that makes them sound shambolic, rather than masters of the start-stop rhythm. Said Canty in 2016, "We thought it was hilarious and we were gonna leave it in the version, and producer Ted Nicely was like, don't be fucking assholes you guys. If you guys have any hope for airplay," we're like, airplay? Fuck you. He's like, any hope for airplay? You're gonna take that shit out. Pitchfork and Alternative Press have noted that if the demo version of Waiting Room was the one that had opened their first release, Fugazi would have influenced no one. To quote Gross again, the most important thing to understand when thinking about Fugazi's songwriting is the vast majority of the band's songs were not as much written as they were assembled. At the very start, most songs were written wholesale by Makai, him presenting a new track and the rest of the band learning it. By 1989, the process had become more collaborative. Any song brought in would be workshopped, rewritten, embellished. By 1993's In on the Kill Taker, all band members were bringing in bits of song to be combined into full pieces. If you listen to any given recorded Fugazi practice, you will hear Frankenstein songs, verses of one song combined with riffs of another. Said Makai in a 2011 interview, "That's how we operated. We just had a bag of parts and we'd find things that would fit together. We were an instrumental band. We really wrote instrumentals and Guy, Joe, or I would say, well, I might be able to sing over this thing." Once the instrumental version of the song was finished, it could be played live years before it would reach the completed album version. While in the instrumental stage, these tracks would have working titles inspired by pop culture or whatever, for example Link Ray and Runaway Train. The argument track, Epic Problem, was based on one such working title. Canty stated, "We had song parts that were total song killers. Once we put them in, that song was utterly doomed. The riff for Epic Problem was like that. It was around for years. Record after record, we could never make it work. Finally, we figured it out and figured it should keep the title." Another example was Great Cop, perhaps the most straight up hardcore song the band ever wrote. It was written by Makai in 1982, taking 11 years from inception to album track. The aspect of Fugazi that most fans in 2019 will probably never experience fully was their outstanding live show. There were many elements that made Fugazi stand out from others in a live setting. For one, the band never used set lists. While this could potentially have led to disjointed sets, awkward fumbling, and the occasional off notes, this rarely happened. The band often able to string 5 or 6 songs together without stopping, able to communicate efficiently on stage so that everyone knew what was next. This was no doubt helped by the band's ample rehearsal time, stated as between 4 and 6 hours a day, 4 days a week. This set listless approach made it so that each show was unique. Before starting, the band would only know which song they were starting with, which depending on the song would indicate how they were feeling. For example, instrumentals like Brendan 1 or Joe 1 seemed to indicate that everyone was in a good mood, that fan favourites might be heard. Opening with something like Break or Do You Like Me suggests a more confrontational show. Sets would alternate between songs sung by Mackay and songs by Picciotto, complicated slightly when Lale started singing live. They were such a fine-tuned entity that they could pull out any one of their 100 or so songs at a moment's notice. Some were played more than others. Waiting Room is their most played track, while it got to the point where they forgot how to play Steady Diet of Nothing track, Polish. Compare this to Blink-182, who played pretty much the same show for 2 years. Despite their unpredictability, there were a few things that could be counted on. There would never be merch. The most famous Fugazi t-shirt design, a bootleg, calling attention to how it was not an official shirt. This anti-consumerist stance can be heard on their iconic merchandise. An entry would be no more than $5. Mackay stated in 1991, "There's a lot of reasons for that. One is that we don't particularly want to pay more than $5 to see a band. I always feel shitty when I have to lay out a lot of dough, because then I want that to entertain my ass. And that's the other side. For $5 we could suck. Because we're human, and we do suck sometimes." Being that Fugazi were a band that came from but wanted to separate themselves from the DC hardcore scene, they took issue with moshing at their shows, believing it to be a boring expression of violence that made things worse for everyone at their show. Fugazi never had venue security at their show. Mackay and Picciotto would police the crowd themselves, stopping the show if people were getting too rough. I've read things with people saying, "Oh, he just heckles the audience the whole time." They don't understand that it was a reaction to the environment. I think when people go to punk shows today, they don't have any idea what those shows were like. Instead of wading in and meeting violence with violence, they would frequently use kindness and humour to pacify the situation. For example, at their show at Fort Reno Park in Washington DC in 1993, a couple of skinhead guys starting trouble in the front rows of their show. Picciotto steps in to defuse.
You know, I saw you two guys earlier at the Good Humor truck, and you were eating your ice cream like little boys, and I thought, those guys aren't so tough. They're eating ice cream. What a bunch of swell guys. I saw you eating ice cream, pal. Oh, don't you deny it. You were eating an ice cream cone. You were eating an ice cream cone. Oh, you're bad now. You're bad now, but you're eating an ice cream cone. And I saw you. That's the shit you can't hide, you know? You got your fucking shit, but you eat ice cream. Everybody knows it. The whole fucking place knows it. Ice cream eating motherfucker. That's what you are.
Don't let people tell you that Fugazi are humorless. Fugazi live shows were also typified by the energy involved and the musical invention on stage. Sometimes they would vamp a song into an extended groove, an evolution of the song itself. Sometimes Picciotto would swing from a basketball hoop by his legs. It really depended on the night you saw them, furthering the uniqueness of any given performance. Their sound guy, Joey Picciuri, began recording the audio of Fugazi shows from their first gig in 1987. Audio for over 850 shows is available to download on the Discord site, so you too, for the price of a Fugazi show, can experience Fugazi live, albeit secondhand. I think if there was one message from the band, it was that whatever is received needs to be examined. I have no issues with bands that do anything contra to the way we did it. Our only point was like, let us do what we want to do, you know? Whether it's their live show, their Discord label, their politics. Fugazi did what they wanted to do. They were the band that said no, because no one previously had desired to say no. They innovated by trying. It could have been a disaster. It could have sucked, but it didn't. Fugazi meant different things for different people. For some, they are the greatest live band ever. For others, they are the band that stuck it to the man and won on their own terms. Another group might see them as originators of post-hardcore, or even the band that did Waiting Room. Others still might know Fugazi as a military acronym for fucked up, got ambushed, zipped in. What you know, or what you think you know, about Fugazi needs to be reassessed. They were not the band you think they were. They were so much more. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, like, comment and subscribe. As always, I'd like to give a big shout out to all my top tier patrons. You're all awesome. See you next time.